Well, it's time to see what is making the headlines of tomorrow's newspapers with the political editor of the Daily Mirror, Pippa Crerar, and the political editor of The Sun, Harry Cole. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. No guessing, of course, what's on the front pages. So let's start with the Metro. A failure of leadership. That's the headline for the paper. The Financial Times says Boris Johnson has rejected calls to resign after the publication of the Sue Gray report. The Guardian finds that Tory backbenchers have turned on their leader over the 12 events being investigated by the Metropolitan Police. Mamma Mia, that's the Sun's headline, over claims that an ABBA-themed party was held in Boris Johnson's Downing Street flat during lockdown. While the Eye has PM pleads for his job. The Telegraph reporting that the Prime Minister will ask for a new report from Sue Gray in a bid to settle that anger and remain in the top job. And here's the Yorkshire Post, failures of leadership in parts of Number 10. The investigation also making the front pages in red wall areas. Reminder too that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. So let's introduce our guests then. Tonight joined by Pippa Crerar and Harry Cole. Long awaited and brief but blunt, I'd guess, Harry?
Yes, wasn't the most exciting document in the world. Fairly damning in its pithiness. It was about 10 pages long, but it's clear that the Metropolitan Police's ongoing investigation, which they extraordinarily said won't take more than a year, earlier today, has taken a very sharp axe to that report. It was gutted of any sort of juicy details, you might say, any details that could prejudice a police investigation, and was more sort of broad brushing. But it was very withering. It found a number of failings inside Number 10, inside the Cabinet Office at the height of lockdown, and simply concluded, without much fuss, that the rules that were expected the rest of the country to follow weren't followed in Number 10. And that puts the Prime Minister in quite an awkward position, who, given the fact that he told the House of Commons that he'd been assured, and in fact he knew, that guidance had been followed at all times. So the saga rumbles on.
Absolutely. The Guardian, let's take a look at that, talks, as many of the papers do, about this failure of leadership that we heard from Sue Gray's report. But, Pippa, any hope that this would be the denouement of the work that you had started in mid-November by, first of all, pointing out the allegations of parties were clearly not true? They're once again shielding themselves, would you say, behind both the Met Police and, indeed, whatever else Sue Gray has to offer.
Well, it is incredible how long this has rumbled on, and as Harry says, we're not at the end yet. I don't think anybody really expected, once we found out that Sue Gray was going to have to tone down large parts of the report and leave big chunks out, after the police said last week that they wanted her to keep the details to a minimum, that this was going to be the moment that it really came to a head for the Prime Minister. I mean, we saw in the Commons today, I thought it was quite interesting, his response. The response from the Tory backbenchers was really angry. It seemed to go down very badly, the tone that he adopted. You had MPs led by Theresa May, but many others as well on his own benches, let alone what the opposition were up to, criticising his handling of the whole affair. But he seemed to sort of pull it back a bit when he got behind closed doors with the 1922 committee and charmed his Conservative backbenchers to convince them that now was not the moment to try and trigger a leadership contest. I think the timing has been the big question, like I say, since last week when the Met made clear that the full report couldn't be published. And it's going to be really interesting to see whether, now that the Prime Minister has managed to buy some time, whether he's going to be able to press ahead and get back onto the front foot, even though we're going to a difficult spring with the cost of living crisis and then the May elections, the potential war in Ukraine, or whether this is going to hang over him and just not go away as more revelations come out, as the police eventually get to the point where they report back. They've said that they have 300 pictures and 500 bits of paper about allegations about gatherings. We learned about 3 new gatherings we hadn't known about up until this point. And we know that the Met are looking at least 3 gatherings that the Prime Minister himself was at, confirming for the first time that the Prime Minister potentially broke the law. So it's not going to be an easy few months for the Prime Minister. They're desperate to try and get back on the front foot.
Yes, and it is indeed worthy of a study of the importance of momentum in politics, is it not? But let's go to one of the areas, Harry, that did irritate Conservative MPs today. This was the failure of the Prime Minister to promise that he would publish whatever Sue Gray had to, what a full report might look like, including Mark Harper, former Chief Whip, who mouthed at him, just publish, while the PM was talking. And there, the Daily Telegraph turning this around, suggesting the Prime Minister will ask Sue Gray for a new report, as if it was always the plan.
Yeah, well, they were quite definitive early on in this, that when they launched this inquiry, it would be published in full, and that would then be placed in the House of Commons, and everyone could chew over it. Then that line has gradually softened over the course of weeks and months now. And then today they had a slightly unforced error. It was pretty clear, very obviously, and I'm surprised Keir Starmer didn't leap on it at the top, that the Prime Minister was very clearly not promising to, once the police investigation had concluded, publish the findings in full. Now, that was clearly a lightning rod for people like Mark Harper in the House of Commons, and it took Diane Abbott to be the first person to notice it, who hasn't always been on the ball for brilliant parliamentary questions when she was on the front bench, for example. But there was a clear feeling that actually, hang on, no, this is unfair. We need to see, if anything, to put this to bed, the full details. Now, the swift statement from Number 10 tonight seemed to quell some of that anger. They are going to have to publish it in full. Now, intriguingly, something I'm picking up tonight is the fact that the Metropolitan Police haven't actually so far been running, haven't been publishing the names of anyone that gets COVID fines. There is a world in which you can see a number of these fixed penalty notices being handed out to Downing Street officials, Downing Street staff, dare I say the Prime Minister, but they would never actually be published by the Met. They'd be breaking precedent. So another row I think is going to be rumbling is, and a question that Pippa and I will be asking almost daily now, I imagine, is, has the Prime Minister spoken to the police, and has he been given any formal fine? Because it's not on the duty, it's not, the onus is not on the police to announce that. So I expect those that are looking for a cries of a cover-up to have a new angle on that one, because it's up to Number 10 to say who's actually been punished.
Yes, Pippa, you said 3 of these alleged events that the Prime Minister was directly involved in. I think the Times tonight is saying 4, one of which there is a question mark over, is what happened on the 13th of November, which is on the front page of The Sun. Mamma mia, the headline there, about this alleged party in the flat in Number 10 Downing Street, something that the Prime Minister was pointedly and repeatedly asked about in the Commons today.
Yes, and the Prime Minister, when asked about it, said that he didn't want to prejudge, that he didn't want to give a running commentary while the police investigation was going on, but didn't obviously give flat denial that he was at the party, or indeed the party took place in his flat. Now, this is one that I wrote about back in November. Number 10 and Mrs Johnson's spokesman vehemently denied that anything had taken place, but I was told that there was a gathering on night that Dominic Cummings left Number 10 upstairs in the flat. This is separate from the separate Lee Kane leaving do downstairs. That there was a small number of people, but the people got, and I quote, completely plastered, and that they were blasting out loud music. In subsequent reports, including some over the weekend, it suggested that ABBA's The Winner Takes It All was played out, reference, of course, to the battle that was going on between Carrie Johnson and her friends and allies in Number 10, and Dominic Cummings and his sort of Vote Leave campaign team is still in Number 10 as well. The reason that this, obviously, despite all the sort of, the juicy detail, the reason that this has become particularly relevant is because it's the only one that we know of that the police are investigating that actually took place in the Prime Minister's own private residence. So it's very difficult in that situation for him to turn around and give an excuse that officials organised it or that he thought it was a work event. It also, of course, brings in the suggestion that his wife was involved too. Number 10, as I say, has completely denied that. But it's a very tricky one for the Prime Minister, and it's certainly one that I'm sure journalists and MPs are going to be particularly interested to try and find out more when that final Sue Gray report finally publishes all those details.
Yes, and it's always been one of the PM's main defences, isn't it? That this is both his home and his office. If he's pictured with alcohol, it's his home, effectively. Let's take a look at the Metro, then, Harry, as well. Another of the newspapers that talk about a failure of leadership, one of the sentences that really stood out in Sue Gray's report. But what about those changes that the Prime Minister suggested that will bring about, a change in culture, really, in Downing Street? There had been rumours that there might be an outright ban on alcohol, but we didn't hear anything about that. One commentator suggesting today that instead of having the Prime Minister's office, we're going to get the office of the Prime Minister, and this won't necessarily make much difference.
Yeah, look, number 10 does have a sort of unique place constitutionally in how it's set up. It's sort of evolved rather than being a sort of department of its own. I think there's an interesting line in the Gray report about, and I presume it's about the Prime Minister's principal private secretary, Martin Reynolds, or Party Marty, as he's been nicknamed, the guy who sent the email to the infamous Bring Your Own Booze event. Now, he is meant to be the Prime Minister's eyes and ears, his right-hand man, his civil service representative. He runs his private office. He runs his day-to-day organisation. But also, he's also seen as a figurehead in number 10. And I think the Gray puts a little finger on that as actually slightly bizarre scenario where the most senior civil servant, apart from the cabinet secretary, who, as the title dictates, is in charge of the cabinet and the running of government, and then ultimately responsible for the civil servant. Number 10 is run by essentially one of the Prime Minister's closest advisors, and almost has too much on their plate. There seem to be things that are slipping through the cracks. There's unclear structures around who's actually in charge, because at the same time as having a civil servant, principal private secretary, you've got the chief of staff, who's a political appointee and a SPAD, and who's actually in charge. PM being pulled in different directions. This PM actually quite like playing off against each other. So all that's going to change, I think.
Could spend the full half hour talking about Sue Gray and Downing Street. We move on to the other big news today, which is, of course, the announcement of a consultation to ditch this idea of mandatory vaccinations, Pippa, for NHS staff.
Yeah, this has been a little while coming, because over the last few weeks we've heard real sort of concern from hospital leaders and some of the medical groups and unions, suggesting that the already under pressure NHS, which has already got large, sort of big shortages in staffing, could not cope with the sudden exit from frontline roles of tens of thousands of NHS staff who have yet to be vaccinated. This, of course, was the decision made by the English or by the government for the English NHS to oblige frontline NHS staff, in the same way it's already happened with care workers, to make sure they're fully jabbed in order to protect patients, they've said. There's been some speculation over the last couple of weeks that the government might pull back from that as a result of those calls by those medical groups. And Sajid Javid, the health secretary, said last week that the government were reflecting on the decision, and now as we've seen tonight, they announced in the Commons that they didn't think it was proportionate anymore, given that we're sort of through the worst of the Omicron wave, to insist that NHS staff get that jab because of the impact that it could have on staffing levels. So it's gone out to consultation, and we'll see what they come back with. But I think we can fully expect.
Pippa, I'm going to interrupt you because we've got 1 minute left, and obviously we've had the breaking news this evening that the Prime Minister is planning to travel to Ukraine tomorrow. He'll meet with the Ukrainian President, Harry. Had been due to be accompanied too by the Foreign Secretary Liz Truss. That clearly will not happen now. She's tested positive for COVID, and in the meantime, his hopes of a conversation with President Putin was delayed. The Telegraph says it because the French president snuck in first. You've got about 30 seconds. I apologise, Harry.
I'm not sure if it was Macron sneaking in first, or the PM having to spend 90 minutes defending whether or not kettle chips are eaten in Downing Street. That's the big issue with Partygate. Is, yes, very serious allegations and a lot of public anger about rule breaking, but also it's sucking so much bandwidth out of Boris Johnson's time. He wants to try and throw the kitchen sink at everything this week. We've got levelling up, trip to Ukraine, possibly some online harms later in the week. But every time he tries to move on, he just gets dragged back in.
Apologies, we've really run out of time.